A few years ago, I was at the University of Shanghai, and I was asked to address China's CEO Forum, 300 or so Marxist CEOs. Fascinating day. And at the end of the final banquet, I walked back with the dean of the business school to the lecture hall, and he said this to me. Some of you heard me share this story. He said, "What am I missing? We in China are fascinated with the Christian roots of your Western past for the sake of China's future. But you in the West are cutting off your own roots. What are we missing?" I said to him, "You're not missing anything." That's where our Western civilization is today. It has almost severed its roots, the deepest, of course, being Jewish and Christian. Now, there are fancy names for that. You can call it a crisis of cultural authority or technically a legitimation crisis, but basically it means that our civilization is a cut flower civilization now. And you know that flowers without their roots will eventually die. And one of the features of our civilization, growing more apparent all the time, is the yawning vacuum underneath it, with its lack of roots. And you can see a perfect storm literally making this. First, there's a breakdown of the old consensus, and now a conflict of many voices, many of them profoundly different. Secondly, you have people using the old terms but putting in dramatically different meanings to them. And thirdly, you see many people using the old terms, concerned with the right issues, but with no foundations at all. And the net effect of these three things is a profound vacuum under our civilization. Maybe the most important of all the issues it touches is human dignity. But it also touches freedom and truth and character and virtue and many other things, and of course, work. And I would challenge you to think of everything we heard last night and the rest of today and put it in the grand cultural context in the US. Because clearly there are various obvious factors making up the context in which we're discussing this, and there are various challenges it raises for us. So this doesn't only affect each of us as individuals next Monday or whatever. As we, followers of Jesus, live the truth of the gospel, it will, by God's grace, be salt and light out into the culture at a most extraordinary time. What are some of the obvious factors? Well, of course, we're in the middle of a recession. But also you can see the savage inequities between the rich and the poor that America's never seen before, that call into question many of the profound things of the American Republic. But then again, you can see the problems of unemployment, or the creation of a culture that puts so much stress on leisure. The work is merely the means to be able to afford the things you want to do in recreation and leisure. And of course, in the background, demographic changes, the graying of America, and so many more people who will live longer now in retirement. All these things are coming down on what we're talking about today. So the challenge is not just we in our workplaces, challenging things like what is likely to be a growing series of corruptions in the next 10, 20 years, as well as all we've talked about, the idolatry of success and fame and the other things. But we've also got to think of the unemployed. I was speaking in the Greek churches earlier last year. Many of them were unemployed. Many have had their pensions reduced by 80% in the Greek crisis. And they were really wrestling as Christian brothers and sisters what it means to have a sense of calling in a world where more were unemployed than gainfully employed. And of course, we're facing that now with retirement. And we need to face the fact you retire from a job, maybe, but you never retire from a calling. And we've got to think through all these sort of things. But of course, it's not only work that's in confusion and chaos in much of our society, it's also calling. Some of you probably received in December the same little email commercial I did. Find your calling in 30 days and join the seminar, price $675. I confess it made me angry. It doesn't take 30 days to discover what calling is. And it certainly doesn't take $675 to discover what calling is. That's a rather trivial but necessary, serious, modern version of what Luther was attacking, the commercialization of the gospel. Why are people now making money off discovering of callings in these sort of ways? It is outrageous, but that's only the beginning. The commercialization of calling, the trivialization, when everything is calling in a loose way, eventually nothing becomes calling and it floats away in the air. And you can see that much of evangelicalism, thinking that it's rediscovering the notion of calling again, has enormous confusions and distortions. Forgive me, but I've even heard, in the last hours I've been here, several people use the word vocational callings. Now, that's nonsense. Vocation is just the Latin root for calling. And calling is just the Anglo-Saxon root for calling. So you're saying calling, calling. But they don't realize it because of the confusion between occupation and vocation. Now, the historical context to that, which is easy to understand, but we've got to clear up what we mean and hold what we mean as powerful and precious and get back as close as we can to our Lord. Let me just raise a number of simple questions. What do we mean by calling? Why does calling matter today? And what are some of the great master themes when we rediscover this powerful sense of calling? What do we mean? This isn't a complicated word. You don't need a seminary degree or Greek or Hebrew to understand it. The word call is the same word used of a telephone call or a bird call. Very simple to understand. The only profound difference is the caller. It is God who is calling. And of course, that makes all the difference. But calling itself is not complicated. We can look in the Old Testament and see how God calls individuals. Dramatically so, say, with the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah. But not only individuals and whole families. Abraham and all his family. But not only families, entire nations. Israel have I called. And of course, all that Old Testament context flows into the New Testament. And you see in the opening announcements of the kingdom this extraordinary way Jesus calls Andrew, Peter, James, John, Nathaniel, Matthew. And immediately it says often after they get up and follow him. They don't know at that stage who he is, Lord and God. But there's something about what he was saying and the way he was saying it. They're up and they follow, even before they knew that they were to bow before him as God become man. And of course, in the rest of the New Testament, we see the Apostle Paul and others expanding on the profundity of this theologically. But look at history, and it disappears. And calling, sadly, is rather like a roller coaster where it comes into view and disappears from view. It's very clear and it's very distorted. In many of the Catholic centuries, it was lost. And it became spiritual only. Monks, nuns, and priests, and not the rest of us. And as you know, the Reformation rediscovered it. And the Reformation laid out a whole number of very helpful distinctions. Get the distinctions and then go back always to the central idea. But their distinction between the primary call which is the call by the Lord, to the Lord, for the Lord. So first and foremost, we're never called to something or somewhere. We're called to someone, and that's always above the other. The primary call. Now, if we were to break that down and look more closely in the Gospels, I think that primary call of Jesus, which you can see in the Gospels, includes at least three great things. First, he calls people to know him and his Father. So at the heart of it is that relationship and the going deeper and deeper and deeper into an intimate relationship with our Lord. Secondly, in the primary call, he calls those who are his followers to know him, to live his way. Now, we can break up the New Testament in all sorts of theological beliefs. But Jesus never called people to certain beliefs, let alone a priority of them or a hierarchy of them. He called people to live his way, the way of Jesus, and they were followers of the way, loving their enemies and all sorts of other things that no one in history had ever called anyone to do. And of course, the third part of the primary call, to introduce others to being his disciples the way we ourselves are, the Great Commission. But that's the primary call, and the secondary call for the Reformers was all that we do in response to that. If he's Lord of all, it's unthinkable that any part of life is left out of it. And I equally, although this isn't technically in the Scriptures, I equally break that down into three simple parts. First, and it's been said by many over the course of the last day, first, that means our giftedness. The very gifts that we're born with and God has given us naturally. And that's been stressed by many. Not just spiritual gifts, no. Natural gifts as well as spiritual gifts. Secondly, resources. We're not born with these. We grow up in families or in different cultures, and we have all sorts of resources that are not natural to us through our birth. And we need to think through all of those. For example, take something rather intangible. All of you, or at least most of you, are Americans. You just take the resource that Americans have of just one simple thing, the can-do spirit, and a culture that encourages it. If you're born up in Bangladesh, say, or Zambia, or many other parts of the world, you can be a Christian with all sorts of natural gifts, but no cultural opportunities to fulfill them. But you Americans, it's not just you have a lot of money, you may have a lot or a little, but you have cultural things that are resources that are part of your talents and the pounds the Lord has given you. Then the third thing is gifts, resources. The third thing, spheres of influence. All of us touch certain lives. Our families, our friends, our neighbors, our colleagues. And with different gifts, writing, speaking on the radio, whatever it is, all of us touch certain lives in various ways, through your emails or your blogs or whatever, your Facebook. Now put those three things together, the natural gifts, your cultural resources, and all the spheres of influence you touch. Those are the talents and the pounds that you've been given, and you're asked to multiply those until we see the Lord face to face and hand them back. And we trust that we'll hear, "Well done, good and faithful servant." None of us hiding it in napkins or burying them in the ground. So if you think, what have I said about calling? Well, this is the way I define it. Calling means that when God says to us in Jesus, "Follow me," everything we are, our beings, everything we do, our actions, and everything we have, our possessions, are given a direction and a dynamic, because now all that is done as unto him. That's calling. Now, secondly, let me go on to ask, why does that matter today? Put this in its grandest context. First, to follow our callings faithfully in every area of life is the expression of faithfulness and obedience. The simple fact is that many Christians who say sincerely that Jesus is Lord are not living it. And the main area they're not is they're not living out their callings throughout the whole of their lives. It's a fundamental expression of obedience and faithfulness. Secondly, it matters because it's so profoundly a part of each of us discovering God's purpose for us and serving, as St. Paul says about David in Acts 13, serving God's purpose in our generation. As I understand it, calling in some ways is the microcosm equivalent of creation. Let there be light, God says. And this entire incredible universe springs into being. But when our Lord says to each of us, follow me, follow me, follow me, what that does for us is to open up that whole purpose and fulfillment that God has in mind for us individually. So calling is not just be who you are. It is that. It's also become what you can become. Yes, it's be who you are. And each of us is unique, made in the image of God with gifts and combinations of character and personality that no one's ever had like us. So certainly it's be who you are. But beyond that, become whom you can be. We think we know ourselves, but we don't. Even those who love us don't really know us. Who knows us to the very bottom of our being? Who knows the potential of that which we aren't now, but which we can be, and which, if we follow Him and rise, we'll go higher and we'll go deeper and we'll go further than anyone could map out purpose for us if we follow that calling that He has for us. It is the central secret of individual purpose and fulfillment, not about us, but about Him and His purposes which we serve. But the third reason it matters is public influence. Do you know the name Sayyid Qutb? He was Osama bin Laden's favorite writer. He gave the definitive Muslim critique of Western decadence back in the 1940s. But what's so interesting and sad about Sayyid Qutb is that Egyptian though he was, Muslim in background though he was, he says he rediscovered his faith, Muslim faith, where? In America. How? By force of contrast with the churches. He was in New York, Washington, and mostly in Colorado. And this is the 1940s, white picket fence America. The old Americanism, still innocent, still intact. No drug, sex, rock and roll. No climax of the 1960s and all that. This is before all that. What he says about the American churches, they were suffering from, quote, grotesque or later hideous schizophrenia. A later commentator on the Californian churches said that they were suffering from being privately engaging, publicly irrelevant. Faith was all privatized, flourished at home, flourished in the churches, but didn't flourish at work, didn't flourish in public life, didn't flourish in the media, etc. And Sayyid Qutb was so horrified that it led him back to the more integrated faith of Islam. Now, in fact, the three Abrahamic faiths all require integration. Jews are required to integrate their faith under the Torah. Muslims, of course, under the Quran or the Sharia. And we who are followers of Jesus under the lordship of Jesus in every area of our lives. But for the last 50 years or so, under the pressures of our modern world, most Christians in America, without realizing it, haven't. And this is why the salt isn't very salty, and the light hasn't been very light-bearing. So here we are, great majority of Americans still identifying themselves as Christians. And yet tiny groups, say gays and lesbians and others, tiny groups, less than 2% of Americans, have far more cultural influence in many areas than we do. And one of the reasons is this lack of integration. And so our faith hasn't made the public influence over the last 50 years that it should have done. A fourth reason why this matters is because here is one of the great contrasts between the gospel and other faiths. There's a simple apologetic principle at stake. Contrast is the mother of clarity. Too many people don't know the gospel because they know only the gospel, and it sounds rather routine, if not outdated to them. But take this area of fulfillment and purpose and compare it, say, with the East. What does the East say? Hinduism and Buddhism. Basically, forget it. Why? When we take ourselves seriously as individuals, it's only because we're caught in the world of Maya or illusion. And the goal of both Hinduism and Buddhism is to become free, moksha. But freedom is not freedom to be an individual. It's freedom from individuality, because individuality is the problem. And that leads to the desire, that leads to the craving, that leads to the detachment, which binds us to the wheel, and we go round and round and round. So, for example, when Buddha was enlightened, he didn't say, I am liberated. He said famously, it is liberated. He'd achieved the not self and escaped the illusion of the bondage of self. When you see the difference between calling and the Eastern view, it's night and day. The difference isn't quite so strong when we look at the secularist family of faith, but almost. What do they say? The secularist family basically says, purpose, yes, but do it yourself. We live in a world of chance. Everything comes from chance. Everything moving to destruction. So there's no meaning out there in the universe to be discovered if you look. If you want meaning, you create meaning. When I was a student, I used to listen to Bertrand Russell, then in his early 90s. His picture of human meaning was Atlas, the Greek giant, who carried his own universe on his own shoulders. Do it yourself. Same in Ayn Rand. Of course, it always appeals to the young, the healthy, and above all, the wealthy. But for most people, they know that to create that world of meaning by themselves over the course of their lifetimes, with the cost of things you see like Atlas Shrugged, what a gloomy prospect that is. And you look at our Lord's sense of calling, in contrast to the East, and in contrast to our secularist friends, and you see here's one of the glorious contrasts of the good news of Jesus with what people are asked to believe today. But there's a fifth reason calling matters, and it ties in directly to this conference. Calling anchors and protects work. You remember I was mocking vocational callings. Well, there's a reason that term came confused. Before the Reformation, leisure was prized, and calling was restricted to the spiritual areas, the monks, the nuns, the priests. They had callings, and you can still find Catholic dictionaries today, and if you look up the word calling, it means to enter the priesthood or whatever. The Reformation said no. It is everyone, everywhere, in everything, including your work. And it was the notion of calling, which was like the booster rocket that got the modern view of work off the ground. And great thinkers like Max Weber say it created the rise of capitalism and many, many other things. So the Reformation said work too was a part of your calling. Everything's a part of calling. But then, of course, when work succeeds, and it leads to success and prosperity and fame and all these other things, Work has its own motivation. And eventually the word vocation, which of course covered occupation, the two became synonymous. And you can see the residue of that in our language today. We talk about vocational colleges or vocational aptitude training. Nothing to do with a Christian view of calling at all, merely various practical things in the work world. And so when people talk about vocational callings, they actually mean occupational callings. But here's the warning. Work for those who are truly diligent does go better in most cases. And that's the story of the Reformation. But usually to the point where it becomes self-propelling, and then eventually calling is knocked away like a booster rocket that's no longer needed when the good spaceship work is cruising around space. In other words, be careful of concentrating on work alone, because when that succeeds, it eventually divorces any need for calling. Now, what are some of the great master themes? I hardly need to say after all the good things we've heard in the last 24 hours. The three that I've experienced as the most powerful for most people are these, and you've heard many of them. I'll just restate them. First, calling means do what you are. Do what you are. The Reformers tied that back to the parable of the talents and the pounds. He gave to each 5, 2, 1, to each according to their ability. The master knew, and our master knows, and we're all different. And calling fundamentally is the expression of who God has made us to be. Now we have to qualify that, because in a fallen world, as we can see in the New Testament, the fallen world is not here to fulfill us. So we may have gifts which the modern marketplace doesn't satisfy. Paul did. His core calling was to be an apostle to the Gentiles. But can he go down to the Corinthian or whatever labor exchange and apostle to the Gentiles, 75,000? He can't. So what does Paul do? He doesn't want to rely on wealthy patrons in the church. He makes tents. And we have the word tent making today, people doing other things to free them to do the main thing. So doubtless Paul made his tents to the glory of God. Superbly made tents, I believe. But that wasn't the core of his calling. It was a part of his calling, but not the heart. And we need to figure that out, especially in a day when so many are unemployed or retired early and then feel they're demoralized. You even have great modern Christians. For instance, one of my heroes in the social sciences is Jacques Ellul, the first great critic of modern technology. Jacques Ellul was an eminent lawyer, and eminent in all sorts of ways, as well as a social scientist. But he always said the heart of his calling was working among teenage boys in inner city Bordeaux. And he did all the academic stuff to give him what he needed to do what he really loved to do. Do what you are. Think through those gifts the Lord has given you. Gifts, resources, spheres of influence. The modern world, the modern marketplace, may not immediately fulfill them. If you were to look at my resume, very checkered. I've worked for secular organizations like Brookings downtown or the BBC in London. I've worked for Christian organizations. Neither quite fitted fully what my calling is, which I'm not saying. But I did each of them in order to get as close as I can. But the overall thing is my resume is very checkered. If you find a career that fits your calling from the beginning all the way through perfectly, God bless you, that's wonderful, but it's not a right, it's a blessing. Do what you are. Secondly, and surely this has sounded out the whole of these days too, calling means everyone, everywhere, in everything. Where did the dreadful idea come from that anything else was the way of following Jesus? As far as we know, it goes back to Eusebius of Caesarea, a very important early bishop, who's important for his historical records. He describes some of the early persecutions and so on. Obviously a faithful brother in many ways. But he introduces the fateful teaching that the Christian life, to quote him, has two characters. And I'm using his words, the perfect life and the permitted life. Now, what's the perfect life? Of course, it's spiritual. Monks, nuns, and priests. What's the permitted life? The lay life. Soldiers, farmers, lawyers, etc., 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 business people. I'm a layman. So you have a two-tier universe, spiritual, secular, perfect, permitted, full-time, part-time. Now, the Reformation shattered that. I hope we'll all read sometime Martin Luther's Babylonian Captivity. It's not about calling at all. It's about the sacraments. But Luther says in one page, the farmer out in the field or the farmer's wife in the kitchen, if they're doing what they're doing by faith to the glory of God as a calling, that's as high and holy as the preacher in the pulpit. Why? It's everyone, everywhere, in everything. There's no higher, lower. There's no sacred secular. There's no full-time, part-time. And that wretched evangelical term still predominates in many circles. Are the rest of us part-time followers of Jesus? Did Jesus ever have part-time followers? We're all full-time followers. It's everyone, everywhere, in everything. And let's make sure that our language and our terminology shatters this. And it comes right down to the way we even pray. John Yates, our pastor at Falls Church, he would be the first to admit he got this wrong many years. I and a friend of mine hammered at him for a number of years, and he didn't get the point at all. He put going to the ministry, going into the youth ministry as higher than anything else in Falls Church. And we gave up on him, to be honest. And one day in our church magazine, there was a headline, "I was wrong." I read it with startled amazement. But when John changed his mind, he not only had to preach the biblical message more clearly, we had to change our praying. All the praying on Sunday was for people who are Campus Crusade or Mission Here or whatever. And we had to pray for the congressmen and the astronauts and the high school teachers and the computer scientists in our congregation. And they operationalized calling in our prayers so that it was everyone, everywhere, in everything. By God's grace, challenge and question. Everywhere you see this crippling old idea of a spiritual dualism, wherever it's in our churches today. The third master theme, maybe the part of the book most people write to me about. Calling means living before one audience, the audience of one. This is incredibly important today because we've gone in America over 300 years from what's technically known as an inner-directed society to an other-directed society. One historian says simply, the Puritans were as if they'd swallowed gyroscopes. Modern Americans are as if they'd swallowed Gallup polls. We're obsessed with all the stuff that other people think. And 51%, 83%, all this sort of stuff every day. USA Today and others, all these factoids about opinion polls and so on. Calling means that we swallow gyroscopes. Our north, south, east, and west are internal because we're living before one audience, the audience of one, not before public opinion and all these various things such as relevance. Now that becomes important, and various of you have raised this over the last day, when we're talking about things like accountability. I remember many, many years ago, 40 years ago when I was a student, I was with a great Christian sociologist in England, and one day some real enthusiasts came in, who were Christians also, and they said to David Martin, "Isn't it incredible, all this new expression of love in the church, including the kiss of peace? Isn't it wonderful now? We actually embrace people in church in the kiss of peace." They were glowing. David Martin turned and said, I'm not impressed. And they looked at him surprised. How could he not be impressed with these expressions of love in church? David Martin said simply, listen, if in traditional society you had the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, and they were to embrace each other with a hug on Sunday, wow, you'd be really impressed. They knew each other throughout the entire week, their home lives, their work lives. If they were to embrace, that would blow your minds. He says, you don't see each other from Sunday to Sunday. And you just turn around to a stranger in the pew and give him a hug because you're told to. And then you don't see him again. What's impressive about that? Just part of the expressive revolution, which means nothing. Now, let me be clear. In the same way, accountability has become cheap today. I was saying this morning, two people in Washington, New York, wherever, and they meet every Tuesday morning for an accountability meeting. How do they hold each other accountable in this highly mobile, fast-moving, and very anonymous society where we are more anonymous than any generation in history most of the time? Well, each has to tell the other what he's done in the previous week, and so the other's holding him accountable for what he tells him he's done, but that may not be what he's actually done. And we use accountability very lightly today in ways that virtually mean nothing. And we have to take biblical teaching of things like accountability and put them in the challenge of our modern context. Because the fact is that in a fallen world, morality is linked to accountability and is linked to visibility. In other words, we can do the right because we're seen to be doing the right. We can not do the wrong because we're seen to be doing the wrong. But in an anonymous society, because of mobility and other things, when more people are anonymous than any generation ever in history, what's accountability? And what's morality? And you can see that even in the Church of Christ, among Christian leaders, it is eroding rapidly. So my challenge would be to think, on the one hand, let's take this notion of work, this wonderful, rich teaching you had beginning last night with Michael's talk, take it and link it always to calling. Why is it we work like that and value work like that? Because we're called by this extraordinary Lord. And one day, all that we work at in our workplace and in all the other places we're working productively, we're going to bring those talents and pounds back to Him. So on the one hand, don't forget to root work in calling. Otherwise, it'll become autonomous and self-propelling and secularizing all over again. That's the story of the Protestant Reformation. On the other hand, take all these deeply biblical truths and always put them in the context of the challenge of our modern culture. That's how the engine through the clutch drives the car. There are far too many Christians who have wonderful theology, wonderful biblical teaching. If we're talking about these things, their orthodoxy and profundity is enormous, but it's disengaged. And we need Christians who have an engaged theology because they know what God is calling us to, but they know that this is what the world is like and the tensions of bringing this to that. Faithful presence isn't enough. There's got to be the dynamic of calling that leads to a transforming engagement. And I would say to you from the bottom of my heart, if you look over the last 2,000 years at the way the great Christian truths have shaped culture, it's probably true that the cross is the most dynamic of all. But maybe second only to the cross is the notion of calling, for the way it's touched individual lives and touched entire cultures for Christ and changed them powerfully. And may it do so again today.